So, good evening, everyone. My name is Antonio Sennis, and I'm delighted to be here this evening and welcome you on behalf of the History Department here at UCL to this year's Neale Lecture. Let me begin with something quite simple. The Neale Lecture is, in one sense, about us as a department. It is an occasion we host, an invitation we extend, and an opportunity to present ourselves at our best, intellectually, collegially, and institutionally. It is therefore a particular pleasure in that spirit to welcome our speaker this evening, Professor Peter Mandler. We are delighted to have you with us. This year, the sense of occasion is sharpened by UCL's bicentenary. In this context, we are reminded that departments like ours do not exist in isolation, but are part of a broader and longer institutional histories, ambitions, and strategies to which we contribute and which, in turn, are there to help shape and support what we do. And it is a particular pleasure to have with us our Dean, himself a historian. Welcome, Nick. The Neale Lecture itself is part of that history. Established in 1970 to honor Sir John Neale, it has become a valued fixture in the life of the department, and an occasion to which we return regularly. This lecture, however, is also about something broader than any single department. It is about all of us who engage with history. It brings together colleagues, collaborators from across institutions and generations, students and alumni, friends and partners, emeriti, former Neale lecturers, and no doubt future ones. There is something important in this continuity. It reminds us that our work is cumulative, shared and carried forward through conversations across time as much as across space. But most of all, this evening is about history itself, a discipline whose importance one might expect to be recognized as self-evident, justified by existence and practice alone. At their best, the study and teaching of history do help to provide a fundamental part of the civic infrastructure of our society, giving it voice, presence, and continuity in a wider world. And yet, as we all know, the importance is time and again questioned, and we find ourselves needing to articulate, defend, and reaffirm it. That work is not undertaken in isolation. It depends on a wider intellectual community and on a set of institutions, formal and informal, that sustain the discipline across different settings, in universities and schools, in archives and libraries, in public history, and in the many spaces in which the past is interpreted and debated. This evening is, in its own way, part of that ongoing work. But I will not keep you for too long. The study of history, after all, has a way of reminding us of our place and our role. And this evening, I'm very much on the undercard. So it will be my great pleasure now to leave the floor to our very own Margot Finn, Astor Professor of British History, who will chair the lecture. Margot embodies in a particularly compelling way the unity of teaching and research that lies at the heart of our discipline. She is at once and seamlessly one of our intellectual powerhouses and the convener of one of our first-year core courses. It is therefore especially fitting that she should chair a lecture concerned, among other things, with the fortunes of history degrees and with the choices of those studying for them. Margot.
So thanks so much, Antonio. That was a lovely way to begin the evening. It's a real delight, as well as an honor, to be introducing Peter here tonight. He's an old friend, old in the sense of the friendship being old, a colleague in many contexts, and somebody I read all the time, as well as working with. I'm going to just give you a very brief sense of the arc of some of his published work, but also try to speak to the ways in which that published scholarship has been so closely entwined with the making and the keeping of our discipline in the UK over the last several decades, sometimes in this very room. He stood at this podium many times before. So Peter's early work spanned from the aristocratic politics in the late 18th and early 19th century, a wonderful book on stately homes in Britain over a very long time period in the modern era, a real interest in the history of collecting, and a significant book on national identity in Britain as well. Now, for many historians, that would be the arc of their career, and they would just stop there. But that was just phase one of the Mandler project. Phase two, and I think he's really still in phase two, and this paper tonight comes out of a very long phase two, has included British urban history, the history of the humanities and the social sciences, and obviously tonight's lecture fits partly in that, but also a lot of really textured, political, social scientific, and yet also humanistic work on education in post-World War II Britain. Really important work there. It's formed all of us in this room, that system, in many ways. We're a part of what he's been studying there. What's distinctive, I think, about Peter, aside from the fact that that's already quite a lot of breadth in the field, is the way in which he has bound that up with minding the discipline in its organizational manifestations. And he's done that as a journal editor, he's done that as a monograph editor, he's done that in the British Academy as the section leader of modern history for many years. But he's also done it through two particular organizations, the Royal Historical Society and the Historical Association, over both of which he's presided. He has spent a lot of time in this building through there, which is where the Royal Historical Society lives. First, for many years as its honorary secretary, in years that saw it fundamentally reposition itself as a modern organization. He's given lectures, the annual lecture that the president had to give, sometimes in this very Gustav Tuck lecture theatre. And it's that braiding together the archival research, the scholarship, the concepts, together with what makes history tick in institutional contexts. And I think it's important that Peter's always taken schools and school children as seriously as he's taken undergraduates. And presiding over the Historical Association, and I can see Becky Sullivan nodding when I mention schools and teachers, has been an integral part of that. We often forget as university lecturers about the pathways that lead those students into our classrooms. Peter has never forgotten that. And some of the work that he's done reminds one forcefully of those parents that wanted their kids to go to university, including the mums. So I think that big sense of a political history, a social history, an educational history, an intellectual history, but also, crucially, the institutions that deliver history up. And that if they fail us, they fail the discipline. So he'll give us bits of all of that, I'm sure, tonight, not to raise the bar on you, Peter. So, tonight's lecture is 8 Reasons to Study History, the Rise and Fall, query mark, that's the one that's really worrying me, of history as an undergraduate degree. It draws from information in UCL's own institutional archives at some level, and there's really no more fitting topic, I think, and certainly no more fitting speaker to have, not only for the Neale lecture, but for the Neale lecture in UCL's bicentenary year. So, welcome, Peter.
It's a great pleasure to be here. Thank you, Antonio and Margot, for those kind words. I mean, just to underscore something that Margot already alluded to, she and I have worked side by side for decades now, not only as historians, but also trying to advocate for our discipline and our profession. And I want to make a particular tribute to Margot for the work she's been doing in defense of the humanities and social sciences at the British Academy. I think I hope everyone here recognizes what a contribution she's making and will continue to make on our behalf. Surprisingly, this is the second time I've giving the Neale lecture. When I was given the invitation, I said, "Are you sure? I mean, do you remember I did it 28 years ago?" You may think that inviting me once to give the Neale lecture is a misfortune, and inviting me twice feels like carelessness. But I was actually really particularly pleased to be asked to speak on this 200th anniversary, partly for the reasons that, again, Margot and Antonio alluded to, that this is a subject that comes organically out of my existing interests, but actually, perhaps less predictably, it's allowed me to go down some rabbit holes to sort of fill in the gaps in my own knowledge of the history of our discipline that have been tempting me for a long time, and I didn't have the excuse to go down. What this has left me with is a vast amount of material, and I'm only going to be able to hit the highlights. I promise you I will keep within the statutory 55 minutes or whatever it is. But it's I think important, as Antonio said, for us as historians to mark these occasions. And as I say, it's been an educational experience for me, and I think I'll probably end up writing a book about it. The story of academic history in this country has been told many times, but pretty much always from the point of view of the teachers, that is, academics like me. This evening I'm going to turn the telescope around and try to tell the story from the point of view of the students. Why would anyone want to study history at university? I'll seek to cover the whole country, but naturally, for present purposes, I will make a special study of Cambridge. No, just kidding. UCL, of course. Why would anyone want to study history at university? The short answer is that for a long time, they didn't or wouldn't. Before UCL's foundation in 1826, the only subjects offered at first degree level anywhere were classics and maths. The historian Macaulay, who took his Cambridge degree in 1822, qualified in classics, although only barely, as he failed the maths requirement, so he didn't get an honors degree, only what was called an ordinary or a pass degree. These subjects were the inheritors of the old medieval curriculum, the trivium and the quadrivium, and were thought the only subjects capable of giving a liberal education, setting up the mind to equip it to tackle any other subject. Sporadic attempts were made to introduce new subjects on the side, notably by the Royal Foundation of Regius Professorships of History at Cambridge and Oxford in 1724, and a Professorship of History and Oratory at Trinity College Dublin in the same year. But in truth, not much education of any kind was going on in these ancient universities, and young men had little incentive to study anything but the degree-granting subjects, if those. Even there, examination was oral and casual. For the idle, the genteel, and the wealthy, these were the people who went to university before the early 19th century, the experience of university was the thing. By the beginning of the 19th century, a different kind of curriculum was being developed in grammar schools, catering to a growing commercial and professional constituency, and in academies for nonconformists who were barred from the universities. While classics and maths were still highly prized, so-called modern subjects, or useful knowledge, were now emphasized. At the more advanced level, subjects useful for public administration like political economy, law, and moral philosophy, known collectively as the moral sciences, alongside them the natural sciences, and modern languages, French, German, sometimes Italian, and finally, what came to be known as the English subjects, English language, literature, history, and geography, roughly in that order of priority. It was via the English subjects that modern history first began to rear its head as a university subject, still seen as intellectually inferior to the classics and ancient history, but with a value as useful knowledge that might make it worthy of inclusion in a university course. Accordingly, when UCL was founded, among its proposed subjects was modern history. Its first professor in the subject was appointed in 1830, and when the London Bachelor of Arts degree was first offered in 1837, it included English history to the 17th century as one of its compulsory subjects. This ordinary or pass degree required multiple subjects, with classics and maths still given pride of place. And along with natural science, they were the only subjects in which further study would give access to a specialist honors degree. And even when after 1859, the English subjects were open to honors study, English history remained subordinate to language and literature. In any case, not many of the precarious middle-class families who were London's prime constituency could afford to support their sons through multiple years of study for a BA degree. Through the 1870s, there were scarcely a dozen candidates a year for English honors across the university, not just at UCL, but King's and Bedford, which opened for women, even though at that stage, their numbers had been augmented by the admission of women. Small wonder that the UCL history professors up to 1860 had only a handful of students. The most serious of them, Robert Vaughan, gave up his effort in 1839 because he had only 4 students and he was paid on a per-student basis. At Oxford and Cambridge, too, interest in modern history remained at a low ebb. Their response to the useful knowledge movement had been not to broaden the curriculum, but rather to raise the academic standards of the traditional classics and maths courses, introducing standardized written examinations and classified degrees in the 1820s. The result was to distract the more serious reading students, as they were called, away from non-examined courses, and the Regis professors found their small audiences dwindling to nothing. The Oxford incumbent stopped lecturing altogether in 1830, claiming the young men are too constantly engaged upon higher pursuits to be able to afford time for attendance on 20 lectures on a subject comparatively so light and unacademical as modern history. His Cambridge counterpart also gave up in 1840. So what was the point of a professor of history at a place like UCL? And by 1860, a new answer was devised: to pass exams. Not university exams, mind you, but other kinds of exams. Gladstone called the mid-Victorian years the age of examinations. Liberal reformers like him, and especially Macaulay and his brother-in-law Charles Trevelyan, were determined to raise the intellectual standards in public life, mostly, as we've seen, by the promotion of competitive examinations in Oxbridge, but also after the Great Reform Act of 1832, in wider spheres, in private and state schools, in the civil service, in the post office, the army, and even in music and art schools. Examinations proliferated in all these places. The flagship exam, to which most attention has been paid, was for the first class of the Home Civil Service, and secondarily for the larger cohort of the Indian Civil Service. They were seen to be more or less on a par intellectually, but of course it was easier to get candidates for the Home than for the Indian Service. Both designed to attract the highest flyers in Oxbridge classics, and thus spurred them to even greater exertions. And so the core of these exams was still classics and maths. But the reformers also wished to extend the competence of civil servants. So the modern subjects, including the English subjects, and so including a sliver of English history, were included from the beginning of the late 1850s. The hope was to extract more talent from outside the ancient universities, from London and from the new colleges that were beginning to appear in the north of England, starting with Owens College in Manchester in 1851, and followed in the 1870s and 80s by Birmingham, Leeds, and Liverpool. But the ancient universities worked hard to monopolize the top 5 places for themselves, and the recruitment patterns shifted to accommodate them too, so over time they squeezed out aspirants from other places. The attempt to widen the range of candidate by widening the range of subjects ultimately failed. By 1910, 84% of the successful candidates had been educated at Oxbridge, another 11% at the ancient universities of Scotland and Ireland, most of whom were classicists, and this left only 5 of nearly 500 places for graduates of London, 2 from Manchester and 1 from Leeds. However, beneath the first class were progressively more layers of examination that were less competitive or less prized by Oxbridge. Entrance to the Army and Navy colleges or to Army commissions was by exam with a similar Oxbridge-oriented mark scheme, but with fewer Oxbridge candidates and more choice of subjects. Exams for second and third class civil service posts, where literacy was at a premium, were aimed deliberately at the English subjects and were thus more accessible to middle class aspirants with grammar school educations, as were post office clerkships from 1881, including for women. And this is only to scratch the surface of the rage for examining. The College of Preceptors offered exams for secondary school teachers, and Oxford and Cambridge rather presumptuously set school exams in modern subjects, the so-called locals, which became a kind of school leaving certificate, the forerunners of our present GCSE and A-levels. So even if the top-level exams were beyond the reach of most humbler aspirants, there were still, from the mid-19th century, more exams for which a knowledge of English history was now valuable. The prospectuses for UCL and the new colleges of the North took to advertising the relevance of their lectures in English subjects by indicating the marks available for various exams alongside the lecture lists. I mean, it was a kind of tease, a come on. And here I give you some examples of those mark schemes put aside the lecture lists for UCL by Creasy, the professor of history, and his English literature counterpart, Masson, in 1859 to 60. This did something to plump up the audience for history lectures, and Creasy's successor, E.S. Beasley, found it worth his while to stick to the post for some decades. Even so, his performance was fairly perfunctory. As one of his students described it, Beasley would come into his lecture room at 2 o'clock every Thursday, give us one lecture on ancient history, one on modern history, put on his comforter and hat, walk out, and that was all we saw of him for another week. How unlike the teaching that you get at UCL today. His lectures with their reading lists and class exams no doubt gave some comfort to the commercial clerks and budding solicitors genning up for external exams, but the standards were not high. So far as I can make out, I consider this to be the great archival discovery of my work on this lecture. So far as I can work out, the future arts and crafts architect C.R. Ashby, who lived with his merchant father nearby in Upper Bedford Place, which is now Bedford Way, where the IOE is, won a third-class prize in Beasley's English history exam in 1875 at the age of 12. Ultimately, exam candidates who hoped to do well were thrown back on private study, or if they could afford them, the cramming companies who were finding good business in central London. And if you aimed very high, you had to go elsewhere. Ashby went on to King's College, Cambridge, sorry about that. Eyre Crowe, the future diplomat, was an exception, who perhaps proves the rule, and who used UCL to help pull himself up to the highest levels. Boarding austerely with his brother who was studying engineering at KCL, Crowe at first relied heavily on the crammer Scoons, fell back on UCL for a few months only for lack of ready cash, but for the most part studied on his own, and came second in the Foreign Office exam in March 1885 with the top marks in English constitutional history, probably in truth no thanks to Beasley. For all but the special few, however, knowledge of the English subjects was most valuable for relatively low-level occupations and did not warrant intensive study. More men and now women appeared fleetingly in Beasley's lectures, but at the end of his tenure in 1893, UCL was still only producing about 15 arts graduates a year for whom history was only a minor part of their degree. So these are people taking a compendium arts degree, all the subjects, with history just a tiny little sliver of it. And there aren't many of them even so. If the new colleges outside London had too few students, Oxbridge had too many. The great majority of university graduates in England came from Oxbridge. The Scottish universities had proportionately more students, but they were mostly studying upper secondary rather than tertiary level courses. Right up until the 1970s, the majority of Scottish students studied multi-subject ordinary or pass rather than specialist honors degrees, which is why they play a relatively minor role in my story. At Oxbridge, the superfluity of rich and idle students who were also only taking pass degrees in the mid-19th century was increasingly an embarrassment, and a more glaring one as standards in classics and maths rose. The same type of liberal reformer who introduced competitive examinations at Oxbridge and elsewhere was therefore keen to address the problem of these so-called pass men or poll men, and knowing they were eating the dust of the reading men, a search began in the 1850s for something better for them to do. A temporary solution in the 1860s was to offer the most respectable of the modern subjects, the moral sciences, especially law and political economy, as an honors subject. And into this stew, modern history was thrown, but it was quickly found that the weight of historical fact to be memorized was dragging down the more serious candidates. And so at about the same time, in the early 1870s, both Oxford and Cambridge introduced the first honors degrees in modern history, introducing a new reason to study the subject. It's not classics. Now, this experiment proved both a success and a failure. A success in that the new history degrees did attract a large number of passmen, whose numbers at Cambridge fell from half in the mid-19th century to a bare 10% by the 1930s. And the numbers of history students rose to about 120 a year. At Oxford, it was even more of a success, with over 250 students a year before the First World War, overtaking classics already in 1898. It's a little bit of an illusion that, because there were still, this is a technical detail you don't need, but my conscience requires me, there were still more people taking classics degrees. It's just in history, more of them were taking history honors degrees than classics honors degrees, but there was still this classics pass degree, which was the easy thing to do and which most people chose. But history did overtake classic as an honors degree at Oxford. No wonder, thought the student magazine ISIS, because history was so much easier and so much more enjoyable. Therein lay the failure. Despite repeated attempts to raise it, the standard of history at Oxford remained low. Most graduates earned only third or fourth class degrees, whereas classic graduates won firsts and seconds. History tutors were at first, by definition, mostly classicists, and they made their low opinion of the new subject known. One Regius professor at Oxford called it an easy school for rich men. Another more hopefully expressed the wish that it might win the landed aristocracy and gentry to study, the least they could do as they owed the state social service. Another, Frederick York Powell, as late as 1902, scorned his history students as persons who do not want to learn, intellectual incapables, unfit and inept persons whom we dub students. To some of you, this may all seem counterintuitive. Why was history being held in such low esteem? Wasn't the Victorian period the great age of patriotism, drum and trumpet history, the Whig interpretation? Actually, no. Most of what we think of in this vein was Edwardian rather than Victorian and applied more to school history than to the higher reaches of education. In higher education, history remained in the deep shadow of classics. It could not provide a liberal education, as it only required memorization of great masses of facts, the flaw that had kicked it out of the moral sciences. Ironically, it was considered too rootless to improve the powers of mind. Only the classical texts that had truly passed the test of time could do that. Among the English subjects, it remained inferior to language and literature, which were the primary subjects aimed at shaping literary expression, for the workaday world of writing reports and précis as much as for aesthetic purposes. The fact that history attracted the idle rich was hardly a recommendation. It could only inculcate valuable but simple virtues like patriotism and factual accuracy, fit for a career, if any, in journalism. The history courses taught at both Oxford and Cambridge, not just in the 1870s, but for most of the 20th century, reflected these constraints. It consisted primarily of continuous national history, English political history from the Norman conquest to some point not too recent, say 1815, which required much memorization of fact, augmented by a shorter period of European history, and dignified with some borrowings from the moral sciences, usually the history of political thought. Exams at first required short, factual answers to as many questions as the candidate could manage in the time allowed. And one of the interesting turning points in the history of the history exam, which I don't have time to go into, is the point at which the instructions, the rubric, changed from answer as many questions as you can to answer 3 questions. In response to the charge that history had no canon, was too changeable and controversial, the courses became ever more narrowly fixed on constitutional history, with a body of set texts exemplified by Bishop Stubbs's select charters, key legal documents of the Middle Ages, and a set, too, of agreed moral judgments on the progress of English history. And you could memorize all of these things with enough effort. At Oxbridge, history was also the victim of what we call nowadays a low-effort bargain. Classicists reluctantly teaching history were content to entertain their students with good stories. As Arthur Stanley put it in 1848, the stupidest undergraduate in a Livy lecture will brighten if you speak to him of the revolution in France. And to stuff their heads with the facts they needed to get their third-class degrees. For their part, the students were happy to reciprocate. The famous tutorial relationship that sprang up between students and teachers was not at this stage an intellectual relationship, but rather a character-building one focused on masculine sociability, sport, and what we'd now call networking. Now, the low-effort bargain did not go unchallenged, especially as over time, more tutors had themselves trained as historians. From the 1870s, you start to have lots of history graduates. Some new chairs were created to supplement the work of the Regius professors, and sporadic attempts were made to improve the level of teaching. But most college tutors thought it was the job of the professors to do serious research, disconnected from the education mission, and theirs to do the teaching. They wanted to retain the confidence of their students and their parents, and not to press on their limits. Degrees are supposed to mean money, and parents want degrees, raged the Regius professor York Powell. We refrain from weeding out what sportsmen call the crocs under our training, the worst of the worst, because we're afraid of losing fees. I'm afraid that's not a phenomenon unknown in the higher education system today. A climactic struggle came under York Powell's successor, the highly professional historian Charles Firth, who directly challenged control by the tutors, the duffers as he called them, over the curriculum and examinations, but he was rebuffed. The course remained unchanged at the time of his retirement in 1925. A convincing case has been made recently that 1066 and All That, published in 1930 with the subtitle, A Memorable History of England, comprising all the parts you can remember, including 103 good things, 5 bad kings, and 2 genuine dates, and usually interpreted as a satire on school history, a case has been made by an excellent article in English Historical Review, was in fact a satire on the Oxford history course that its authors, Seller and Yateman, had to suffer through between 1919 and 1921. Their final exams, like the test papers in their famous book, compassed mainly the general outlines of the political history of England as may be gathered from a modern textbook, including biographies of great statesmen, with moral judgments. Was this king good or bad? Was this policy the right or the wrong one? Equally subject to memorization rather than debate. And I don't think the article that I mentioned points this out, but I'm pretty sure that the question, do not draw a sketch map of the Battle of Bannockburn, is an amusing conflation of the kind of questions that they were asked on the exam, like, draw a sketch map of the Battle of Bannockburn, and of the kind of questions that their tutor, Jan Clark, who had actually more ambitions for history, but who could never get his questions onto the exam, the kind of questions that he wanted to write, the advantages and disadvantages of the inductive historical method with special relation to ecclesiastical litigation of the early Lancastrian epochs. Professional historians like Firth, though still thin on the ground, sought to make a pitch for history as a standalone subject in its own right, as capable of conveying a liberal education, as the classics. But if they were going to succeed, they would need to do so outside Oxbridge, in pastures new, and that is just what happened at the end of the 19th century. This part of the story starts in the unlikely environs of Lampeter in North Wales in 1881, where a young Oxford history graduate named Thomas Tout was appointed professor of history at what was then the only degree-granting body in Wales, a small college mostly training for the ministry. As an Oxford contemporary of Firth's, Tout immediately started to experiment with more analytical and research-based teaching, with emphasis on special subject classes based on original sources. In 1890, he moved to Owens College in Manchester, where he found a fairer field for such experiments. Owens, much like UCL, had been teaching history from the 1850s to small numbers of students with a personal interest, or those preparing for London matriculation or other exams, and a few for Oxbridge entry with factual or descriptive secondary level type teaching. When Tout arrived in 1890, the level had already been bumped up by another reforming refugee from Oxford, Adolphus Ward, who had had the freedom to design his own history honors degree when Owens College joined the new federal Victoria University in 1882. This was the kind of short-lived federation that brought together colleges in Manchester, Liverpool, and Leeds. And Ward had fled Oxford to Manchester precisely so he could do such a thing without any duffers to stop him. Building on this foundation, by 1904, Tout had introduced an advanced version of his Lampeter curriculum with 2 special subjects based on original sources, seminar teaching German style in a library where students could consult the sources during the teaching session, and for the first time anywhere, a compulsory dissertation for honors degree candidates, a reform which Firth had tried and failed to introduce at Oxford. Tout's example was soon followed by yet another Oxford refugee, Alfred Pollard, who came to UCL when a second professorial post was created in 1903. I'm going to say almost nothing about the great Sir John Neale, but I will have quite a lot to say about his great supervisor, Alfred Pollard. Pollard is normally considered as a pioneer of postgraduate education, the founder of the Institute of Historical Research. But here I want to stress the ambitions for undergraduate education, which he shared with Firth and Tout. London had finally introduced an honors degree in history in 1896. But in his inaugural in 1904, Pollard charged that, roughly speaking, there is no such thing at the present moment as a history school in the University of London, portraying it as one of the somewhat numerous Cinderellas of London University who wait the advent of some fairy prince to raise them in their proper station of life. No prizes for guessing who that fairy prince was meant to be. First, he cut a constraining tie to classics, inducing London to drop compulsory Greek from its art degree requirements. That had somewhat limited the number of arts candidates. Then he set about introducing some of Tout's innovations, such as seminar-style teaching in a library, initially here at UCL, and then for postgraduates at the IHR in the 1920s. And that's why seminars are still held at the IHR in the library rooms, surrounded by the original sources, although I don't see many people taking them off the shelves any longer. Most importantly, alongside Tout, he made the claim for history as a liberal education in its own right. The study of history, as he said in his inaugural, was not a vocational or a technical pursuit. Rather, it made you a better man, developing to the utmost possible extent the faculties, mental, moral, and spiritual of mankind to enable them not merely to exist, but to live the fullest life of which they are capable. No humble ambition. To do so, it had to break out of the political and constitutional straitjacket of continuous national history, as taught at Oxford, to encompass the whole life and not merely the political life of nations, the evolution of thought and not just the development of events, useful not merely to the politician and to the publicist, but to the philosopher, the scientist, and the physician. It could develop not only the imagination, but also the judgment and above all the powers of mind by studying causes, an explanation of how mankind reached its present state of development as individuals, as societies, as nations, and as empires, and by considering the world as it is, or was, not an idealized or an abstract world, but one peopled by real human beings in all their variety and their different, not fixed, moral viewpoints. We have here, in short, most of the arguments for studying history, which we still make today, and to which I will return at the end. And yet, if Oxbridge had too many students and was reluctant to take them seriously, everywhere else still had too few students, even if they were being offered a better product. By the early 20th century, history had gained something in status. From 1900, it was finally a compulsory subject in state elementary education. In 1906, a second English history paper was introduced into the civil service exam, increasing the number of marks available. And in 1916, the exam was revised again in an attempt to put classics and the modern subjects on an equal footing. There were honors degrees in history not only in Oxbridge and London, but also in the now separate universities of Manchester, Liverpool, and Leeds, and Birmingham, and at last in Trinity College Dublin and the Scottish universities. But for all Tout's and Pollard's high-minded talk, material conditions did not suddenly change, and the risk and expense of an honors degree in history was still too great for nearly everyone outside Oxbridge. In the first 20 years of the honors degree at Manchester, barely 2 candidates a year presented themselves. Pollard, as we've seen, arrived in London in 1903 to find the history school non-existent, and for some years after, he also only managed to pull in 1 or 2 candidates a year at UCL. The professional historians were in danger of creating a profession without any audience. A deus ex machina was needed, and that came from another unexpected direction, the government's education department, when all of a sudden, a new and compelling reason to study history to degree level emerged: to teach history. Up until around 1900, as I've noted, history had played a relatively limited and low-status role in schools. It went in and out of state elementary education. In grammar schools, it formed part of the English subjects, but not the main part. In elite public schools, it stood in the shadow of classics, as it did in universities, and was mostly taught badly by classicists. In any case, there were no state-funded secondaries at all in England before 1902, and still very few secondary pupils in Wales. History lecturers in higher education cultivated elementary teachers with night classes, and from 1895, day training centers in universities. but few were able or aspired to take degree courses. All that changed after 1900. Local authorities in England were enabled to open their own grammar schools, and state funds were available to private schools to subsidize free places. Across the UK, secondary enrollment surged. More importantly for our purposes, history was now made compulsory at the upper levels of primary and in local authority secondary schools. As one history educator put it in the 1930s, history may be said to be a creation of the 20th century. Even more importantly, in Scotland, secondary teachers were now required to have an honours degree, which was still very unusual in Scotland. And in England, an honours degree was strongly encouraged. For example, teachers with honours degrees started on a higher point on the national salary scale. Better still, in Scotland, their fees were paid and means-tested maintenance grants offered, and maintenance grants offered in England as well. An honours degree in history was no longer a risk. It could now be an investment. So all of a sudden, a new business in history was established. It is often said that Tout or Pollard built their schools of history and were thus responsible for the history boom of the first half of the 20th century. It would be better to say that a degree of mutual interest was recognized. Tout and Pollard were assiduous in their courtship of trainee teachers. Pollard was the prime mover behind the foundation of the Historical Association in 1906, which brought together teachers and academics in a common purpose, and Firth, Tout, and Pollard were, uncoincidentally, its first three presidents. Whoops, that's not right. How did that get in there? There we are. I hope I'm not going to have to go back to that one later. Anyway, the fourth, as you see, was a woman and Irish nationalist, Alice Stopford Green. The HA was well ahead of the Royal Historical Society. It took the Royal Historical Society another 100 years to have its first female president. Not Margot, she was number two? Number two. Dinty Nelson of blessed memory. These academics saw at last a possible receptive audience for their special subjects, their seminars, their dissertations, even for their postgraduate degrees. But their success was built on the rapid inflow of new honors students, especially women, a large majority of them intending a career in teaching, a factor consistently underestimated in boosterish accounts of the rise of the arts in the first half of the 20th century. Take Birmingham, where thanks to Leonard Schwartz, we have good data for destinations. This, by the way, I think is the most astonishing statistic in the entire history of history, or of the humanities. By 1938, of those in employment after graduation from Birmingham, 84% of male arts graduates and 88% of female arts graduates were teachers. Even a majority of male science graduates were teachers. Teaching was the main occupation for which any degree was useful. New university colleges were popping up all over the country to cater to this new demand between the wars, with the preponderance of their early cohorts women. Women formed the majority of external London students, that is, people studying for London degrees in other places, in Britain and in the Empire, and an even larger preponderance of internal students. I think this is where this is supposed to be, yes. What is it? Yeah. In 1924, Pollard preened, London granted 110 honors degrees in history, which is pretty good since it had been, like 4 when he arrived. And 20 from UCL alone. You can have a couple of nice seminars with 20 students. But he didn't mention that 80% were women. I mean, he didn't mention it because he didn't actually want to draw attention to it. When demand for secondary teachers fell off in the 1930s, so did the number of history graduates, and so did the proportion of women. But the impact of teaching careers on university enrollment was long-lasting. As late as 1961, 35% of all graduates and 80% of female arts graduates in employment went into teaching. Teaching sustained the arts after 1945, after the Second World War, when secondary education was made universal across the UK, but relatively speaking, art subjects were in decline. Globally, the Cold War and the space race endowed science careers with glamour, and at home, efforts to reindustrialize seemed to demand higher qualifications in science and technology rather than the arts. While the number of students who took history at higher school certificate or its successor A-level more than doubled between 1938 and 1953, the number taking physics quadrupled. A riffle through the pages of The Pollardian, the UCL History student magazine, published intermittently from 1950, reveals a certain defensiveness about the value of a history degree in this atmosphere. The dominant concern of many undergraduates today is that the study of history seems to give them little advantage as potential salesmen or industrial managers, wrote the UCL History Society president in 1951. Art students were always being asked, what is the use of studying history, wrote another student in 1953. And the old patriotic bromides would no longer do. So they fell back on a properly Pollardian answer: history is useful as a mental discipline, a liberal education, which felt in the 1950s like a weak half-truth. A recent graduate answering the same question, what is the use of studying history, gave the wholly truthful answer: to teach history, which is what she was doing herself. But she granted that for men, the prospect was nightmarish, such posts for them being thin on the ground compared to science teaching or indeed industrial management. To make matters worse, the end of the 50s saw C.P. Snow's polemic against what he thought was the excessive dominance of the arts in British higher education, the two cultures, entirely ignoring the fact that the trend had been steadily away from the arts towards science degrees since the war. And again, actually, in the two cultures, what Snow was really observing was the very large numbers of these third-class pass men or poll men at Oxford and Cambridge, not seeing that a whole other world of higher education had opened up elsewhere, which was dominated by the sciences. And then another unexpected thing happened. Just when establishment opinion was echoing Snow on the need for even more scientists and technologists, the trend went into reverse. Around 1960, growth in arts A-levels began to exceed growth in the sciences. A few years later, predictably, the same trend hit universities. If you've ever heard me speak before, you've seen this chart. And it has some peculiarities which have to do with the bad data, and I'm not going to belabor them. If you want to talk to me about them afterwards, I'm happy to. Among other things, you can ignore that dip in the middle. It doesn't mean anything. The chief point of this is that science's share of all degrees peaked at, that's the orange line at the top, peaked at 57% in 1965 and fell almost continuously to a low of 38% in 2012. Why did this happen? I've written a good chunk of a book about this, and I don't want to belabor it now with unnecessary detail. For the next few minutes, I'm going to be deluging you with numbers. The main driver was at first a tremendous surge in university entrance beginning in the early 1960s. Affluence, and especially the rising aspirations of the generation born during and after the war, meant more pupils were taking O-levels and A-levels and their Scottish equivalents, and more clamoring for places at university, places that government supplied with an expansion that lasted until the early 1970s, doubling the proportion of the age cohort going into higher education to about 14%. These new entrants were less academic and less career-focused than previously. They weren't more female. The proportion of women remained steady at around a quarter of all students and nearly half of all art students. As more of these educated young people delayed entering the labor market, employers who had previously recruited at age 16 or 18 found themselves willy-nilly recruiting graduates at age 21. And thus it was that law and accountancy became graduate occupations, and many other non-professional occupations followed suit. I don't think it had much to do with the brilliant training that people were getting at universities, just that the best candidates were no longer available at 16 or 18, and you picked them up after they got a degree at 21. Employers were happy enough in the emerging knowledge economy to have these more mature workers who could be trained on the job, and thus it came about that almost any cognitively demanding academic subject came to be accepted as the preface to a career. And there was very little connection between the subject and the career. Now, history was in the same boat as many other subjects to benefit from this trend, but it did have some special advantages. It was an established school subject, and its growth there, which had been tepid in the 50s, accelerated in the 60s. In the more relaxed labor market of the 60s, school students felt freer to take subjects which they found interesting and enjoyable and which they were good at, and history ranked high on all these criteria. And I've just highlighted there the growth of students taking history at A level in the 60s. It's quite sharp. One of those Pollardian writers in 1953 said at the time that a few people have the courage to say that they read history because it is colorful and they enjoy it, but now many more people said that because it didn't take so much courage, and it was true. History also enjoyed steady but less spectacular growth at degree level. In 1955, there had been about 1,000 honors degrees a year awarded in history, and that number had doubled to 2,000 by the mid-70s. In both cases, A-level and degree level, history had to compete with new subjects. That's one reason why the history growth is flatter at degree level than at A-level, because there are more new subjects to do at degree level, especially where the social sciences were proving very attractive to both men and women. And so its relative share dropped. This is the share. But even in relative terms, it's striking that its share held at about 4% of all degrees right through the 1990s. And when it dropped down to 3% after 1992, circled there, and that's a real drop, when Polytechnic students were counted as university students, that dip came not because few Polytechnic students were studying history, actually quite a lot were, and I'm glad of that because I got a job in rather dire circumstances in 1991 at a Polytechnic, which was starting a new history degree. But only because, again, new subjects, notably the creative arts, were being introduced to the university sector through the Polytechnics, taking share away from all traditional subjects. In fact, history numbers, here we are again, the numbers, grew rapidly in both post and pre-1992 universities. And they peaked at over 12,000, as you can see, in 2014. These were years of dramatic university expansion in all subjects, but again, relatively, history stood up well, maintaining that 3% share until 2012. I'll be returning shortly to what has happened in the last decade, clearly a less cheerful picture. Let me first say a few things about what we can now see as the heyday of history at the universities for half a century from the early 60s, about how and why history at university changed in order to remain attractive to students, a smaller proportion of whom were going on to teach. Only 10 to 15% of history graduates today go into teaching, and who now had a much wider choice of subjects to study at university. During the period when history had benefited from the influx of aspirant teachers, it had not needed to update its act, and in many places it didn't. Manchester and London were flagships for professional history conveyed professionally to future school teachers, but newer centers, often staffed with prestigious but lackluster Oxbridge graduates, offered a poorer product. The 1066 and all that curriculum of continuous national history remained the norm at many of the newer university colleges. Stories abound of schoolteacher parents and their schoolteacher children recalling the exact same lectures, read out mechanically by long-serving history lecturers clinging to their Oxbridge gowns. Small group teaching and regular essays were not usual. Kingsley Amis gave a picture of just such a fusty history department dominated by an elderly professor with antiquated Oxbridge habits in Lucky Jim, the book and the film, based on his own experiences at Swansea and his friend Philip Larkins at Leicester, and corroborated since by historians of the departments at similar places like Sheffield and Exeter. I mean, they give a very gloomy picture of how things looked in the 50s. The glamour of science depressed more than numbers in history departments of that era. But when numbers picked up in the 1960s, so did morale. I wouldn't want to adjudicate credit between lecturers and students, but the younger breed of lecturers did have higher expectations. By the 1970s, only 12% of them had Oxbridge doctorates, and in any case, even Oxbridge teaching was getting more professional. The course I did in the mid-1970s at Oxford was still in form, the same as that laid down in the 1870s. Continuous national history, a short period of European history, a bit of distasteful political thought that no one wanted to teach, and a special subject in the third year for those who really cared. But the wine in those old bottles was headier, with textbooks thrown out the window, lectures downplayed for more engaged tutorial work, and long reading lists of academic monographs at least on offer. And outside Oxbridge, the history curriculum had changed. It finally cut all the apron strings of classics. It wasn't until after 1966, it took me a while to work this out, that London arts degrees dropped the Latin O-level requirement. I think it was still open for individual departments to change their matriculation requirements, but it was in 66 that the Faculty of Arts dropped the Latin requirement. It became more interdisciplinary. Economic history featured strongly, and more global, first with American and Russian history, then gradually with Africa, Asia, and Latin America. One thing it did not become was integrated into a broader liberal arts curriculum, although that was strongly urged by the Robbins Report in 1963, by government bodies, and indeed by universities. The University of London pressed its arts faculty to abandon honors degrees in the mid-60s in favor of a more flexible American-style multi-subject program. But the History Board of Studies held out for a Pollardian approach, arguing that history encompassed the whole field of human experience and development, and that its range and variety provided an intellectually worthwhile education. Here, employers, lecturers, and students seemed to agree, feeling that students deserved and benefited from 3 years of intensive study of a subject they had chosen because they liked it, and the single honors degree thrived. Although doubts were raised about the viability of this system in the 1970s when demand for higher education slackened, demand reemerged in the 1980s, especially from women seeking careers, both older women returning to higher education after child-rearing and younger women taking up higher education before child-rearing. The system expanded hugely and rapidly without changing much in structure, and as we have seen, with history holding its own. It was not until surprisingly recently, when the proportion of the cohort going into higher education surged towards 50%, that the worm emerged from the bud. A new criterion for advanced study has come to the fore, which poses a challenge to the degree. Is its true purpose to make money? And if so, is history the best option? Politicians, you notice we're on number 7, so we're getting near the end. Politicians and pundits had, at least from the 1960s, been urging what they thought of as better choices upon young people in what was an almost entirely demand-driven system. At first, these urgings took the form of appeals to collective interests, national needs, or manpower planning. There was a panic over the swing away from science, the diminishing share of science degrees between the mid-60s and the mid-70s that chided young people for putting their short-term impulses over the economy's longer-term economic interests. But this subsided when the swing nevertheless continued, and economists decided to accept that any form of higher education was better than none, though for a time in the early 80s, Thatcher tried to stem the swing by halting higher education expansion altogether. That too was quickly abandoned under demand pressure, and the evidence is that for the next few decades, through the 80s and 90s, and up to as late as 2006, when a team at Warwick did a major survey of university applicants, young people were still making their subject choices at university on the basis of enjoyment, interest, and exam success, with, as we have seen, relatively favorable consequences for history. Well, this changed around 2012, when for the first time in 50 years, science began to take a larger share of graduates, and the arts and humanities share shrank more rapidly. The greatest beneficiaries were social studies subjects such as business and law. As we've seen, absolute numbers of history graduates peaked in 2014. 50 years ago, speaking at another anniversary of UCL history, its historian Nedgley Hart, who died just a few weeks ago, wrote, as he admitted optimistically, "I would expect that any lecture at the time of the bicentenary will still be dealing with upward-sloping graphs." Sadly, it is not so. In the last 10 years, we've experienced a 50% decline. It's a little difficult to say precisely why this is the case. Social surveys don't often any longer ask students the reasons for their choices, preferring to impute those reasons from quantitative data. And here I summarize brutally a complex picture which I spell out in more detail elsewhere. Clearly, two nearly simultaneous factors loom large. First, the economic crisis of 2008, which, as the economists say, has scarred the labor market perceptions, not necessarily the realities, of young people. And second, the trebling of tuition fees announced in 2010, which sharpened awareness of university as a personal investment. It's very hard to adjudicate between these two elements. The tuition fee argument is the one that's heard most often, but there's been a deeper plunge in history and English enrollments in the US, where there was no such sudden increase in fees. And on the other hand, going the other direction, little decline in humanities enrollments in Scotland, where there are still no fees at all. Other factors must also figure. The impact of declines in reading, on reading-heavy disciplines like history and English, the changing demographic shape of the student cohort, with larger shares of Black and Asian students who in surveys show less emphasis on enjoyment and interest in their subject choice, and understandably, given the labor market hurdles they face, more focus on labor market outcomes. What is to be done? We historians understandably fall back on those Pollardian arguments for history as a liberal education, updated and made ever so slightly more utilitarian in a set of reasons for studying history we might sum up as being human. They are now highly various. There are still those who see history as a continuous process of development, and thus argue that a study of the past will illuminate the nature of the present, something Pollard himself believed. There is, relatedly, the prudential value of history. It helps to understand the present by teaching lessons from the past, moral and ethical as well as practical, though this is more commonly asserted in schools than in universities. There are the virtues of studying the past for its own sake, as a branch of social science that studies social processes and the causes and consequences of change over time, but which also has moral and ethical dimensions, lending an appreciation of the diversity of human behavior and experience, and what derives from this, the cultivation of empathy, also current in Pollard's time. Despite his anti-Whig tendencies, Pollard recognized the value of history in consolidating national identity. He was, after all, an historian of the Tudors, as was his student, Sir John Neale. And in national identity, we have added since personal and group identities as central features of history. Pollard denied that history had any use as a means of increasing our individual or our national wealth, but his successful claim for history as the basis of a liberal education incorporated the case for history's ability to juggle disparate types of evidence, to hone our analytical and research skills, increase our capacity for argument and debate, express ourselves orally and in writing, all skills which are now seen as decidedly as a means of increasing our individual wealth. And in an age of AI, when there is a fear that machines might be doing some, if not all of these things as well as humans can, there must also be an enhanced value just in being human and armoring ourselves with all these qualities to match or monitor the machines. Of course, I wholeheartedly endorse these arguments. But if there is a lesson to be learned from the piece of history I've been offering you this evening, it is that our professional arguments are not necessarily the ones that have weighed most heavily with young people making choices about how to spend some crucial years of their lives. Our arguments have worked best when young people were relieved of the burdens of necessity and were able to make freer choices, and especially when there was a social consensus that an extended period of exploration, study, and maturation was good for young people, extended as far as age 21. For most of the last 200 years, this extended period was denied to all but a few young people who could afford education to 21. It was not until 1963, when the Robbins Report argued that higher education as a social and an individual good should be made available for all those who are qualified by ability and attainment to pursue them and who wish to do so, that such a social consensus behind higher education became evident. The Robbins principle proved sustainable when only 10 to 15% of the age cohort benefited from it. It came under progressively more pressure as it would extend it to 30, 40, 50%. It remains to be seen whether we can sustain it at the much greater cost it requires today, and if so, whether our powerful cultural and intellectual arguments for history will be heard above the claims of the much wider range of disciplines into which the world of knowledge is now divided. We probably won't need new reasons to study history, but we will certainly need new conditions to make some or all of these 8 reasons salient again for young people and their parents, and for society at large. Thank you.
Is this on?
You have to turn it on.
That's on? Perfect. That was wonderful, Peter. Thank you so much. Absolutely brilliant. We have 22 minutes for Q&A, and we also have some moving mics in the form of the head of department of UCL History and also Chloe Ireton, who is very much to be thanked for organising tonight. So I'm going to look for questions, and if I don't see any immediately because you're being shy, I've got one right there. Go for it.
Hello, my name's Mike. I suppose I'm part of the history of this institution. I was an undergraduate listening to lectures here 53 years ago, so it's a little bit odd to see my own personal history forming part of a history lecture. A couple of points. So I'm old enough to remember the mid-1960s when you mentioned the scientists sort of came up and then dropped away again. I might suggest the reason for that, of course, is disillusion, because the Harold Wilson government came in 1964 promising a revolution, white heat of technology, and it all went crump in the matter of a couple of years. And I wonder if that possibly contributed to the decline of physics and engineering. But obviously that's a different subject. But talking about history, something you didn't mention as a factor in why students may have wanted to come to study history at universities over the past 20, 30 years is simply the growth of the history as a popular entertainment, television programs, etc. Has that had any effect, in your opinion?
Okay, so the two points there. The first is about the science, and the second about history. As far as science goes, I mean, to be honest with you, and this actually applies to both your questions, I'm a little skeptical about some of the current events explanations for subject choice decisions, because in this country they start at 13 when people choose GCSE subjects. And although parents and teachers have some influence, young people, as I said towards the end, are mostly making subject choices on the basis of what they are good at and what they like. And now, what they like might, of course, be influenced by current events. But to take the science question, the swing began before Harold Wilson came into office. There was a disillusionment at the end of the 60s and the early 70s about science and technology. That's absolutely right. I don't think Harold Wilson had much to do with it. In America, I mean, it's interesting that saying this at a time when we've just sent a man to the moon for the first time in 60 years, 50, 60 years. In America, there was a real late Cold War retreat from high technology. The arms race was tapering off. The space race came to an end. And in this country, there was and in America as well, there was a very strong kind of countercultural reaction against science and technology. Again, you can see this because they did ask young people. There was a government commission in 66, 67, trying to find out why young people weren't doing science. And they did actually ask them, and especially young women said, and young men said this too, it's about things rather than people. And as I say, there's this countercultural current which encourages young people to reach out for subjects which are more about people than things. And that's why the social sciences become very powerful. As I say, I mean, I'm a little skeptical about current events of any kind as an influence. If you look at the growth of history in popular culture, that's something that's very strong already in the 50s and 60s. Just as measured, for example, at sales of history books. They're rising very dramatically in the 50s and 60s. So I think, there was a general reevaluation, new appreciation of the humanities, which did eventually have an effect on subject choice at university. But it's probably more general than it was specifically about history. I mean, as I said, almost all of the humanities subjects did better in that period, especially after science began to decline. Just because any subject seemed appropriate for a future career, and people chose the subjects they liked. But if only social scientists would ask students why they make their decisions, we'd have more information along the lines that you are suggesting. But unfortunately, they don't. Economists just count the numbers, and then they impute motives from economic theory, which is not very helpful.
At the reception, you'll be able to take, a bit of a social survey. We'll expect to see you with a handbag. We've got a question in the row there.
Is it concerning to you that AI could be used to generate primary or secondary sources, and we won't be able to tell the difference?
Well, I think as I said briefly at the end, I actually have a relatively positive view of AI in that I can already see that it can do lots of things for me that I can use. But for that relationship to hold, AI has to get better, but also I have to get better too. And so clearly what we need to do, and I know this is not a very popular view amongst a lot of my colleagues, is we have to train people how to use AI. I also think we have to train people how to do without it. I think we need to do both of those things. So I would like to see more AI-free teaching and assessment, but I would also like to see more teaching and assessment aimed at employing AI responsibly. So, and I think it's a mistake, and I don't just mean a tactical mistake, I think it's a mistake in principle for a lot of our humanities colleagues to say, as they are saying now, it's all slop, or it'll be like MOOCs, it'll go away. It's not going away. It already is doing lots of things which we want it to do, and it could do more.
Yeah, thank you very much. I wonder if you might comment on the role of the curriculum, history curriculum in schools, particularly, and I'm wondering particularly in relation to the post-2014 decline, whether there might be something to say about that.
Yeah, see, ask Becky Sullivan. Becky Sullivan's the chief executive of the Historical Association. She's the sort of boss of the history teachers. She would never describe herself that way. I mean, look, curriculum does make some difference. So, for example, in English, most English teachers in schools are convinced that the new GCSE and A-level curricula have killed English dead. And that may help to explain why English is falling more rapidly than history. But, you know, all the humanities subjects are falling. History is falling a little bit more shallowly than others. And again, I think regardless of how bad the curriculum is, or even how badly students are taught, if they're given the freedom to choose to further study in subjects that they enjoy and they're good at, they will do that. So I don't think curriculum is negligible, but I don't think it's as determinative as we'd like it to be. I mean, as with the gentleman's point earlier about Harold Wilson, it flatters us, it encourages us to think that there must be some simple answer to these questions. We just pull a lever, right? We elect the right politician, we implement the right policy, we have the right curriculum, and all will be roses. But when you're looking at the behavior of millions of people, it's not that they're determined by the factors alone that economists imagine, but their behavior is determined by factors that you cannot get at and you cannot change without going much more deeply than what's taught in a classroom or who's in number 10.
Thank you. I just had a question about the language.
Sorry, where? Oh, you're
sorry.
right.
Yes.
That's
yeah,
right.
We're still in this. Yeah. Just about the language of practical or useful knowledge in
Yeah.
this context, because that keeps getting asked, and you were talking about how people will be asked, what's
Yeah.
the use of studying history? But the thing that was very interesting about the history you were giving us was the 19th century arguments for useful knowledge
Yeah.
involved the introduction of history. So I'm wondering if you could just speak more about that aspect.
Do you mind if I just talk about the 19th century? Because I'm relieved to have a question about the 19th century. I began as a 19th century historian. I've spent a lot of time recently working on the 20th century, but I was so, again, another reason to be very grateful for this invitation. I was so glad to be able to, 1826, that was my goal. And it's been such a pleasure to revisit that. So I was expecting, because I had done some work on this 40 years ago. I did some work on the Society for the Diffusion of Useful Knowledge, which is one of the factors, the groups behind the foundation of UCL. And what I remembered from that was that, history was one of the leading subjects. But actually, when I went back to look at it more closely, I find that it was really always, it was part of the English subjects. It was always subordinate to English language and literature, and then geography tailed even further behind. And I think this was because, partly as a foil to the emphasis on classics, but partly also because obviously command of the language is the tool which upwardly mobile, people who are seeking upward mobility through education, it's the tool that's most valuable to them. And it's the one that education can actually affect. Language and literature seem to be at the core of what was deemed useful knowledge in the early to mid-19th century. And what was interesting to me was not only that was the case, but also, and it is a different issue when you get up to higher education, it took a long time for history to work its way up the greasy pole. I mean, again, apart from Oxford and Cambridge, there were no degrees in history elsewhere in this country until the 1890s. I mean, not even in London, and not even in Scotland. And it took a while to persuade people that history could be just as useful as something practical like English language and literature. And indeed, when history was taught in the 19th century, it was taught, usually these exams that I talked about offered you a paper in English literature and a paper in English history, and it was the history of the literature and the history of the country covering the same period. So, you would do a literature exam on Shakespeare, and then you would do a history exam on Elizabeth, in that order. And, Shakespeare was seen as more useful in that sense than English history, because it gave you facility with the language and a deeper understanding of the language. So, and this is one of the themes of this lecture I hope came through, is that it took a while for history to emerge, and when it does emerge, it's not so much as useful knowledge as a liberal education which can do everything that classics can do, but in a language that we can understand.
Got a question over there. Yeah.
Hi. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yeah. So I'm a secondary school teacher, and I work in an inner London school.
Yeah.
And a lot of the students I see from ethnic minority backgrounds obviously take sciences, but recently I have noticed that students are taking history and English at university.
Yeah.
I just wondered if your research kind of touches on that at all.
So I've written about this in this paper, which was published last year. And also, the British Academy now has, this is partly thanks to Margot, a wonderful site with statistics about humanities and social sciences. And one of the things it offers are statistics about the proportions of different ethnic minorities, and majorities, frankly, I mean, all ethnic groups, their differential participation rates in subjects. And I think, this is something that changes over time, because a lot of it has to do with the migration experience itself. And we all know this, don't we? The first generation, second generation, the third generation. And I suspect that what you're observing is partly an effect of that change over time. But we're at an relatively early stage in this migration story. And the fact is that what is the one subject which has the highest proportion of Asian students at university? It's subjects allied to medicine. That is not medicine itself, which is hard to get into, but nutrition, nursing, ophthalmology, and pharmacology. I mean, a very large, I think 42% of all subjects allied to medicine are taken by Asian students. And Black British students, the largest proportions are mental health nursing, and sociology is high in business studies. So, and those are obviously just, they're partly cultural, but they're also partly generational. That is, these are subjects chosen because of the perception about useful knowledge, and also what's going to get you a guaranteed job and get you out of a situation of disadvantage. But yes, that changes over time. And there's also what people call peer group effects. That is, I suspect in inner London, where the majority of secondary age students are non-white, that actually has a reinforcing effect in encouraging people to be a little bit more adventurous and a little bit more diverse in their subject choices, because they no longer feel like a minority in the same way, and they don't feel like they have something to prove, and they don't therefore have to take those choices which give them that opportunity. But that's purely speculative, and as a historian, I'm not very good at predicting the future.
I'm going to jump in with an anecdote, actually, that speaks directly to this question, which was that each of the main exam boards in England now has a migration GCSE. Mm-hmm. And when the largest one, which was the third one to launched, I had a really interesting conversation with a Academy Trust history lead. And he was saying, talking to parents, and these were born outside of Britain parents who had born in Britain children, they were saying to their kids, oh, yeah, I didn't really think history was important, but this story is important because it was their story. And so I wonder if there are, with some curriculum reforms of that sort, they may be one of the routes for us to keep students interested in history. One anecdote does not a trend make, I will recognize, before I'm told that by Professor.
No, of course I hope you're right. I mean, I hope all of those arguments that we make have more purchase than they have done in the past. I mean, unfortunately, the countervailing effect, I totally agree with that, but the countervailing effect is that students and parents are now persuaded that they really have to choose high-income subjects, and they're persuaded that those high-income subjects are subjects which are not high-income subjects. So, I'd actually like to focus on disabusing them of that.
So we've got one there, and then we've got Ben Kaplan down here.
Hello, I'm another secondary school history teacher, and yes, teach migration through time as well. But I wanted to go back to the relationship you talked about between women, history, and teachers in the early 20th century, and just to see kind of how much do they go to be history secondary teachers, or is it all teachers, and does it help women's liberation?
Sorry, just said you tailed off there, but say that again.
Does it help?
What are the options you're offering me?
Does it help women gain more freedoms, that relationship with history? And I suppose, are they going into teaching history, or is it into primary school and history is just the vehicle?
Yeah, well, really interesting question, and if I do write this book, I'm going to spend a lot of time exploring that further because I only know certain things. This gives me an opportunity to advertise I'm going to get this wrong, aren't I? The first woman to get an honors degree in history from UCL. I think it's Lydia Grubb. I'm pretty sure it's Lydia Grubb, but I've only explored a few of these cases.
What year?
1902. The degree came in 1896. As I say, there were hardly anyone doing it, but there were 4 people in 1902, and one of them was Lydia Grubb. In fact, there was another woman as well. And Lydia Grubb was a Quaker missionary trainee, and so she was doing a history degree so that she could go out to Madagascar, as it happens, and become a missionary teacher. And she had her career there. And she was unusual because she was a Quaker and a missionary in that she kept teaching even after marriage. And of course, the biggest problem for women going into teaching was that there was still a marriage bar. So that's why the statistics I always cite are 88% of women in employment. And actually, in the interwar period, when women tended not to marry until their late 20s or mid-20s, they actually did go into employment and they did have a career before they got married and had to leave. And definitely, teaching is overwhelmingly the most empowering, as well as the predominant occupation. It's the most empowering force in middle-class, lower middle-class women's lives in the early 20th century, and it's grossly underappreciated. As I say, I said in the lecture when I was doing this research, I mean, Pollard and Tout, they made the history degree possible. No, well, yes, but only because there were lots of women who were offering themselves for it. And to give them credit, Pollard and Tout were pretty egalitarian. Another of the early London history BAs was Eliza Davis, who I don't think went to UCL, but Pollard got her sufficiently excited about history that she did a master's and then she did a PhD with him. And she had the readership in London history here at UCL that was created for her after the First World War, because she was doing most of Pollard's teaching for him while he was increasingly doing postgraduate teaching. She then also became a fixture at the Institute of Historical Research, and in fact, the IHR in the 1930s was known as Miss Davis's Institute. And honestly, I mean, there were very few women, especially if what I think was, in her case, rather modest lower middle class origins, very few women who had got to those dizzy heights in any occupation in the 1930s.
One of the things that really surprised us when we had the 150th anniversary of the Royal Historical Society, the medieval historian Katie Cubitt, I think, just went onto Wikipedia and looked up who were the recipients of the Alexander Prize.
Oh, yeah.
So the Alexander Prize is a prize for your first article, and it was instituted in the 1880s. In the first decade of awards, more than half of the recipients were women. And that just shocked us. It just completely threw out everything we thought, almost all of the medievalists.
And that's because 80% of all history graduates were women. Yeah. I mean, it was bound to be the case.
Yeah. Ben Kaplan, have you got?
Yeah.
You've got a mic. Great.
I've got it. Is it working? Okay. Peter, thank you very much for what was both entertaining and educational, and offered a lot of perspective, longue durée perspective, with some maybe salutary perspectives and lessons for us. I guess, I mean, what struck me about your story was about how late fundamental change came, how long the Renaissance humanistic tradition of the classics remained dominant. And I think I sort of knew this before, but you fleshed it out and told the story from a new perspective. And of course, you tie this strongly to the institutional change that came with it, demand for teachers. So in other words, it seemed like the most important change in your story came, though it's longue durée, relatively forcefully and strongly, and not quite suddenly, but in the first decades of the 20th century, in the 1920s maybe, above all. And so that makes me cast my mind back on the 19th century, where you're happiest perhaps talking, and made me want to ask you about UCL, because we tend to think of the founding of the institution as coming with as a time of radical disjuncture in higher education. But it doesn't seem to have been that when it comes to the teaching and the study and the rationale for these things in our discipline. So does this study that you've done and the figures you've adduced and the correlations shed any new light, perhaps shedding a more kind of conservative understanding of what was happening in the 1820s with UCL?
Yeah, very acute question, and I should say immediately that by focusing on history, and particularly history's rivalry with classics, I'm only looking at a part of the scene, right? Because the other part of the scene is, well, two other parts of the scene, which are more important at UCL, are natural sciences, which you could do an honors degree from the beginning, 1837, and which formed a large part of the general degree as well, and professional training in law and medicine. Now, law and medicine perhaps not so revolutionary in the sense that you could still enter those professions without academic training at all. They were still essentially apprenticeships. But natural science, if you want to get into science and technology, you have to know something about science and technology. And I think if I was not just talking about arts subjects in that 19th century context, then I would have to say a lot more about natural sciences, and there I think it is more revolutionary. I think, nevertheless, the ideological and political radicalism of UCL couldn't change society on its own. And the point about arts degrees is that although the grammar school curriculum included these modern subjects, which are all the subjects that we think of as the sort of standard humanities subjects today, there was no incentive to, and in fact there were steep costs to spending any of your time after you left school doing those things, because there was nothing you could do with them. And even the middle class people who predominated at UCL didn't have the resources to just take 3 years off and study. So I do think from that point of view, it does point to the limits that an educational experiment limits on what it can achieve in default of fundamental social change. And one of the things that changes in the early 20th century, the reason why all those people take history degrees, is that the teaching profession is well established, and it is one of the new principal avenues of social mobility, not just for women, but for men as well, which hadn't been available in the 19th century.
Yeah, and there was no, as you said, there was no public secondary education.
There was no public secondary, so everyone is paying fees.
That triggers the demand, isn't it?
Yeah. Well, yes and no. I mean, the lower middle class is getting larger, and it's paying more. It's willing to pay more. I mean, most grammar schools in the early 20th century, even the state grammar schools, were mostly fee-paying, right? I mean, we forget this. State grammar schools were usually at least half fee-payers and half free-placers. So, and that was growing. Wherever you live, wherever the local grammar school was, which opened after 1902, I mean, it opened because the local middle classes wanted a fee-paying grammar school, not because lots of people expected to get free education. So it's a combination of the two. I mean, the government's contribution made a difference, but just allowing local authorities to open fee-paying secondary schools, which they were banned from doing before 1902, allowed that that buildup of aspiration in the lower middle class to express itself.
We could continue on for another hour, but we are going to do so at the reception. So I'm just about to explain to you where you go for the reception, at which you can pelt Professor Mandler with some additional questions, but also recognize he has a bad cold and needs a drink. You're going to be going down, if you're coming to the reception, 2 flights of stairs, the stairway right there. You're going to then go that away towards the IAS Common Ground. There are signs, and there are loads of locals who will also help to escort you down those 2 flights. But before we do that, I just want to step back and say, really what struck me, Peter, is not only how long it took for history to be a thing in a thingy way, but also how many of the problems we're suffering under now, they're not new problems. We've been there before several times in different iterations. And that should actually give us some faith and some confidence, because here we are, actually a fairly robust discipline as these things go.
There are 8 times more people doing history degrees even now than there were in the early 1960s.
Yeah, that's something of an accomplishment for us to celebrate downstairs. But we don't know what Professor Mandler is going to do for his 3rd Neale when he's asked to do that. But we're delighted that tonight...
I don't have another 28 years.
We'll ask you more rapidly for the 3rd one. But it's really absolutely wonderful to have this, particularly in our bicentenary year. So thank you so much.